One of the biggest things that differentiates the feel of competitive play in League of Legends against regular games is the concept of the draft. Drafting is the phase of the game in which teams will take turns picking and banning champions, slowly crafting out their own compositions while attempting to counter as much of the enemies as possible. As important as the players on a team are in being able to be flexible and pilot multiple champions to victory, it is equally as important to craft the right draft to create the best playing field possible for your players to shine. Many of the greatest moments in League of Legends history have only come about thanks to creative and thoughtful drafting, and it is the purpose of this video to help you understand a little better the basics behind competitive drafting in League and how potent it can be to have a strong understanding of it. If you like this video, I would appreciate it if you liked and subbed, but let's get going. Alright, there's actually quite a bit to drafting in competitive League, but I'll try to cover most of the basics for you so you can understand how to apply that in your own situations, whether it be in Clash or even in your own amateur or competitive endeavors. Draft philosophies can vary from team to team as well, especially in competitive play. Some teams are allowed to bend the rules a little bit if they have certain answers or special picks that are able to get them unique advantages, but it very much depends on the players and the team that we're talking about. But as a quick rundown, I'll be talking about components and interpretations of draft, which includes the differences between red and blue side, what you should be doing in each phase of draft across both picks and ban phases, understanding the concept of team comp identities, directional understanding of draft, and knowing what champions are available to counter the enemy comps, and how all of this can work together to kind of create your draft. Some quick terminology that's commonly used in drafts that you may have heard are things like B1 or R1, R2. These are short forms to represent the pick order of champions from both teams in their respective slot on the roster. For example, looking at B1, the B in B1 represents blue side and the 1 represents their first slot pick. An R1, R2 pick represents the pick phase for red side, since they've been able to pick both their first and second champions at the same time. Before we even begin to start breaking down what goes into crafting team compositions and good drafts, we need to understand both sides of the draft and how this influences our decisions when we decide to make our team compositions. Generally speaking, blue side typically has power in taking power picks from meta champions, and generally those with strong flexibility in draft, both in roles and in team compositions that champion can be built around. The ideal blue side drafts stay as flexible as possible after committing to their B2, B3 picks, and then essentially all-inning on their comp with their B4, B5 selections. Blue side has trade-offs in that although they have the power of the B1 to essentially get whatever champion they want, but have to deal with showing their cards on B4, B5 picks. These picks are meant to hedge as much as possible against the powerful R5 true counter that red side has. This leads well into explaining the strengths of committing to red. Where blue side's strengths revolves around its power picks in early phases, red side has a few benefits in draft that also make it a really compelling option. It has a soft counter in the R3 slot and a true counter in the R5 slot, which gives teams opportunities to counter if they can find it. Good red side drafts thrive off being able to abuse these presented opportunities to counter and should be capitalized on whenever possible. So let's start off with the initial ban phase. This part of the draft will allow you as a player to establish a strong baseline, get rid of any potential blockers against your players and the team comp you're trying to go for, and laying the groundwork to prepare for the first rotation of picks. Keep in mind that this stage and every other stage of the draft is also influenced depending on if you're blue or red side. The initial bans essentially prepare both teams to minimize the damage and create opportunities for themselves to pick their ideal champions. One big factor to keep in mind throughout this is of course the blue side first pick to come right out of the bans. So red side has a bit of an obligation to ban out as many annoying B1 picks as possible. Depending on the current metagame, this could mean that red side has to ban the same 3 picks no matter what, which gives them pretty little power in this phase. Something to keep in mind is that the more OP picks there are in the meta, the more leverage red side actually has in being able to be more flexible in bans. This is because the initial bans are just as much about the R1, R2 picks from red side just as they are for the B1 pick. If there's say 5 or more arguable power picks within the meta, red side can actually be advantageous because blue side can't secure a strong enough advantage with just the B1, meaning that the R1, R2 allows red side to take 2 powerful picks, giving them an advantage. Blue side's initial bans in general plan out for specific annoying picks against the enemy's specific team, as well as removing any potential strong R1, R2 openers. This does mean that generally speaking, that blue side has a bit more flexibility in their opening bans. After the ban phase, we reach the B1 pick, in which blue side should be taking the strongest available champion to them. This is generally a flex pick champion that can be played in multiple roles, or a generally broken champion, or a combination of both of these things. Red side then has their chance to go at the OP pick pool, picking two champs that are also well-rounded and are generally flexible or universally useful champions. From there, the B2, B3 attempts to counter whatever R2-1, R2 was picked, or may try to get some other really strong remaining power picks. This is where you may start to see some blind picks come through, because eventually someone on your team will have to do so. This will again depend on the meta, but generally speaking, many teams enjoy blind picking things like support and jungle because those roles have historically been okay to blind pick and don't really get countered too hard. There can of course be metagames where this isn't the case and hard counters can exist, so we have to keep that in mind. From here, we get onto the R3 pick, which is the first counter opportunity presented by red side. This is because this is the last pick of the first phase of the draft. This is a potential power pick because red side can use this to either pick a champion that counters what blue has presented so far, or to greed a pick that would otherwise be riskier. This is a good slot to blind champions that you would be scared to blind normally because you are shielded by the two bans right afterwards. For example, if the draft scenario led you to wanting to R3 Camille, you can burn your two bans on champions like Jax and Renekton, giving Camille a lot more room to work with and giving that Camille reassurance in a potential counter. The rest of the second phase bans are focused on champions that you have in mind either picked already or for champions that you plan on picking in the second phase. This could mean either burning your bans to shield your R3 pick or setting yourselves up for a strong R4 pick, because that's generally where red side has to blind something. Bans can also be used to prevent champion picks that complement the enemy's comp and maximize your potential to counter. You also have the true counter in R5 to keep in mind, so as long as you ban out the most annoying offenders, you should be in the clear. On blue side, this is where things tend to get a little bit scary since you essentially have to reveal your entire hand to the enemy team. Use your two bans to limit easily blindable R4 champions and also make more room for your B4, B5 picks. The R4 pick comes out now, and in most situations, you'll generally have one of two options. The first is to counter whatever champions blue side left up for you to snipe in case those exist. This is because sometimes teams will opt to actually blind a lane in their first three picks because they value it enough, but this also means that it gives you an opportunity to counter it in B4. More often than not, the enemy has committed resources to banning out the strongest counters, but this doesn't mean that we can't seize the opportunity to take a free counter. Sometimes teams will even try to be really cheeky and go for a crazy pick on their R4 slot in order to throw the enemy off guard and give them as little time and resources as possible to counter them. This is where we've seen crazy jungle picks come out like Dardoch's Kayn or Jose Diodo's Fiddlesticks. Second phase is usually the best time for these really strange and off-meta picks to come out because the enemy team has very little time to try and respond to you with any interesting choices of their own. Most of their champions have already been locked in at this point, and adapting to these champion picks will be less reliant on picking champions that can actually counter these champs and more on trying to use the champions already picked and your remaining available picks to create a cohesive strategy in order to answer. A lot of the time though, in an R4 slot, you'll be relying on the second option, which is having to blind a champion. Most of the time, the enemy has done a relatively good job hedging against your current picks, but has given some hints as to what options they have to round up their comp. The R4 pick is usually reserved for someone to blind, typically a solo laner, their champion, that minimizes as many bad matchups as possible while also providing a decent amount of value to their composition. Of course, it's not going to be perfect most of the time because innately, most champions in League of Legends have some counter picks available, but minimizing the damage is going to be the key here. Red side having to blind R4 is also really beneficial here because of the power of the R5 pick. After the R4 pick, blue side is also placed in a similar predicament in which they'll have to essentially reveal all their cards and all in on a composition that they think will get them the most success against the 4 champions that have been revealed so far. This is when teams essentially commit to their composition style and what kind of roles and forms that they want their champions to take on. This is usually only possible off the back of a few flexible picks from B1 to B3. So if you've already committed to a directional style or type of team comp before the B4, B5 picks, this phase is instead dedicated to picking champions that can further highlight your team's strengths or tech pick potential counters to the enemy's comp. Once these picks are revealed, we now make it to the R5 pick, where red side has an opportunity of power to get an advantage in the last part of the draft. This is the one chance in the draft where red has the complete opportunity to counter blue side without much answer. Most of the time in the current meta, this slot is reserved for a specific solo lane in order to guarantee a great matchup, or at times can be moved to other important roles that can counter an entire enemy comp rather than simply focusing on a specific matchup. Red side is heavily defined by having a strong R3 and R5 pick, so it's pretty important to finish strong with these two picks in slots. Alright, so now that we've done a walkthrough of each phase of the draft, I wanted to cover some topics that allow that little bit of personality or flavor to come out on draft and why certain teams can make certain decisions. The first one is actually the concept of player proficiency versus picking things that are just OP for the sake of it. Sometimes certain teams or certain players will have preferences on what they think is good and what champions they think are better than others, and there's going to be a little bit of variance there no matter what the consensus is on the general metagame. That's why it's kind of interesting to see certain power picks come out, but then other teams not opting for it because they have a belief in something else instead, or they believe that their player is so good that it doesn't really matter, right? And they're able to draw their own version of drafting because of that. Like a great obvious example of this is Viper's Riven. Obviously, Viper came up to the top of the ladder being a Riven one trick, and even in professional play, he's managed to make it work and allows himself to almost be defined like that. A lot of teams that play against Viper actually have had to force themselves to ban Riven against him because of how much of an issue it is. So there's a little bit of a dynamic there, understanding your players, and that's kind of what makes it interesting there. Another quick concept to understand to help you kind of build out your drafts is the concept of directional draft advantage. So when you're thinking about team comps and you're building them out when you're drafting, you generally want to think about which direction that your team wants to play, right? You have your engaged comps, which are the typical mosh pit comps. You know, you have your Kaisas, there's things like Camille Galio, engaged supports, maybe engaged junglers. We've seen that in the past with like the Hecarim, and now we're seeing that still with other champions like the Viego come out or the Xin Zhao. If you're thinking about the way these champions position in general, they want to play forward, right? They want to push ahead and dive into the enemy backline, right? That's a forward comp. A backward comp is kind of like a little bit of the opposite, actually. Comps like this generally thrive in environments where they're given enough space to operate, and if they are given this space, they're able to really siege or really abuse. These are generally comps that thrive more off of poking, or they play a really front to back style and they allow the enemy team to engage onto them first. So think of things like the Lulu Cogs of the world, or the Kindred, or the Ziggs, you know, champions that really are really good at creating space and use that space as an advantage. The last thing I wanted to cover outside of the direct stages of drafting is the concept of strong side and weak side. A big thing that defines a winning draft is the team's ability to have multiple options or to play through multiple win conditions. Usually, since League is like a snake draft and you're trading things back and forth most of the time, you're not going to be able to get winning matchups all across the board, right? In most cases, you're going to have to blind something, and the enemy team, more likely than not, is going to have to counter you, right? They're going to take that opportunity, they're going to take that information and try to counter you with it, and then therefore it should kind of balance out. You'll have winning matchups in some sides and losing matchups in others, right? So there's that other aspect as well of balancing out strong side, weak side, sometimes getting, you know, winning matchups all over the place, which is really good, but generally choosing to be weak side based on how your players play, how they're able to, you know, manage themselves under these different scenarios, how these team compositions can complement the players and these playstyles in relation to the power picks, and generally how they're able to thrive off of this based off their own experiences. So when you're thinking about all of these things all at once, when you're crafting your drafts, it becomes a lot more than just about the champions, right? It's about your players being able to manage these champions. It's the combinations of these champions working in like unison. It's the ability of your players to be able to pilot everything together. So there's so much really to consider when it comes down to it, especially in high pressure situations like, let's say, best of fives, where drafts can actually evolve from match to match when teams identify certain blockers that prevent them from winning the game. There's actually so much to it. And just by seeing a certain pick come out at a certain time, when we're watching these players just pick it, or the teams just pick it, there's so much more context that needs to go into it than just what we see on our end as a spectator. And that's why I find drafting so interesting. And I think the goal for me of this video is to basically help you get a better understanding of why drafting decisions are actually extremely complicated when it comes down to things, and also how we as players can come to appreciate these decisions more and kind of use this to thoughtfully craft and apply this in our own games. This could be as simple as in solo queue. If you happen to have a champion pool of multiple champions, you can pick certain ones at certain times. And I really hope I was able to convey that message to you today. All right. So we've made it. We talked about the entire stages of draft and how we can use this information to help understand the different parts of draft and how to create advantages at each stage. This video is supposed to help understand and give a bit of context as to why certain champions come and go into being powerful picks within the meta and why certain champions are picked in certain slots. I personally find drafting one of the funnest topics in League of Legends, and I hope I can share that enjoyment with all you today. Other than that, I'll see you on the next video. Stay fresh.